the author of the Magnitsky bill. I tell people all the time, it's not anti-Russia. In fact, it's a tool or a lever to help give the Russian people, the ability to demand, more accountability in the system. The issue of Sergei Magnitsky, is kind of illustrative of a lot of other cases. I mean, here's a guy who actually exposed corruption, and his reward for exposing some of the worst corruption in Russia's history was not a thank you, but he was imprisoned and beaten and tortured, and he died in prison. And he's essentially murdered. So notwithstanding all that's going on in the world, I mean, my hope is that the United States and the EU and other concerned parties with regard to human rights will continue to press Russia on human rights.
How do you think how Magnitsky Act could be used by the others, in other cases? Because many people think it's all about Sergei Magnitsky.
Well, it's named after Sergei Magnitsky, but the legislation was originally global in its scope. It got narrowed down to Russia, but still not just about Magnitsky. It's about any case that involves corruption or human rights violations within Russia. So a lot of the people, not everybody on the list is related to the Magnitsky case specifically. And so I think that the way it could be used is that individual cases should be brought to the United States government, and they should be urged to consider putting the people involved in whatever the wrongdoing may be on that list. It doesn't have to be just related to the Sergei Magnitsky case.
What should be what should be this evidence? What is necessary in order that people are added up to the list?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a high bar in terms of being able to get on the list. There are people who are not on the list that I think should be on the list, but the U.S. State Department and the U.S. Department of Treasury believe they don't have enough evidence to meet the standard that they've put forward. I think in order to be able to find out, what enough evidence is, you have to work with the U.S. officials, to try to pursue a particular case against an individual. But look, none of this is a substitute for Russia creating a system where there's checks and balances, where there's accountability, where there's a rule of law. The reason why there is a Magnitsky Act to begin with is because those things apparently don't exist in Russia. Ultimately the goal is you want to change the Russian system in a way where people who do bad things go to jail. Not people who do good things go to jail, but people who do bad things, people who are guilty of corruption, people who are guilty of terrible human rights violations, that they are held to account. The whole point of the Magnitsky Act is basically to name and shame people and to say to them that there's a consequence. That if you do something terrible, if you are guilty of mass corruption, if you are guilty of human rights violations against an individual, that there's a consequence. You may not feel that consequence in Russia under the current system, but understand that you'll feel the consequence as it relates to the United States, and hopefully as it relates to the European Union and other places around the world. If bad behavior is not checked, then what's the incentive for that bad behavior not to continue? The Magnitsky law is not general sanctions against all the Russian people, because this is very pro-Russian people. It's against individuals, and I think that we need to aggressively use the Magnitsky Act to continue to point out those individuals who are guilty of things that I think by any standard would be unacceptable. The fact that Sergei Magnitsky was not rewarded for exposing some of the worst corruption in Russia's history, and instead imprisoned, tortured, beaten, and then murdered ultimately, says a lot. It tells you how messed up the system is, and and a system that allows for that to happen doesn't encourage much confidence by the international community to want to invest more in Russia. So I mean, if Russia wants a good future, a stronger future, they need to address some of these issues.
But do you think is there really enough of political will? Because what we know, it was really hard also to make the Magnitsky bill and the Magnitsky Act to make it.
It was very difficult. I mean, the Obama administration originally was not for it. In part because there are a lot of people who work, in our government, who, believe that their job is to make sure we have a decent relationship with Russia and we make no waves, that we don't rock the boat, that everything's just calm. And sometimes that meant that we turned a blind eye to terrible human rights atrocities. And but Bill Browder, in particular, and others who came to Congress, who testified before the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, which I co-chair, educated us about the Magnitsky case, educated us about the fate of Sergei Magnitsky, and we were all horrified. And we all felt that we had to do something. And the Magnitsky Act was what came out as a result of some careful thought about what that response should be. Our approach to dealing with ISIS is kind of like the same old, same old. They do something terrible, we increase our military operations. They do something terrible again, we up our military operations. And I'm not saying that there's not a military component to our response to ISIS. I'm just simply saying that I think what's missing is a long-term, clear-cut strategy that has a beginning, a middle, and an end that I think makes me feel like we're moving in a direction that's going to make these kinds of occurrences like the one in France less so rather than more so. Look, in terms of the trade-off between privacy and security, I'd like to think you can have both. I don't know all the details of how it all transpired in Paris. Before we all kind of jump to conclusions and say you need to do this or that or this or that, we ought to understand what happened and what didn't happen, and how this operation was put together and how it was directed. But there is a balance, and we have to make sure that people's individual rights are not trampled on. We also need to make sure that people aren't targeted unfairly because of their ethnic background or their religion. Or because they happen to live in a community where one of the, bad guys was from. These individual rights and these individual freedoms are very, very important. That doesn't mean you can't do it better. But sometimes what ends up happening is we go from one extreme to the other. I don't want us to go to the extreme, so far to the extreme where we're compromising people's dignity and their rights and their civil rights and their human rights. We have to be very, very careful about this. And I know it's hard to have those thoughtful discussions in the aftermath of a terrible tragedy, but it's precisely times like this that we need to be thoughtful and careful.